Well, viruses, first of all, are very much smaller. Bacteria can be seen under a light microscope, just about. Viruses can't. And all the pictures that you will have seen on the media of coronaviruses have been taken with an electron microscope. So viruses are probably of the order of 100 times smaller than a bacteria. As well as being smaller, they're also vastly simpler. They consist of a small package of genetic material, which is simply coated round with some protective proteins. And the genetic material is simply enough to make a new virus particle. In many ways, the genetic material of a virus is like an architect's plan for a building. The plan is there, but it doesn't have all the workforce in order to convert it into a new virus. The only way a virus can make a new virus is by going into a cell of a higher organism, a bacteria, a plant, or an animal, and, if you like, hijacking the workforce to make new virus particles that the cell normally has to make its own cellular material, and the virus has to get into a cell, and then it hijacks the apparatus and many new virus particles are manufactured. So the cell that it gets into takes over making new viruses rather than doing its normal job of making new cellular material. Many virus particles are made within the cell, and then the virus particles exit from the cell, very often killing the cell in the process. So the virulence and the pathogenicity of many viruses results from killing the cells. When we're talking about the simplicity of viruses, that can be characterized by the number of genes they carry. Now, genes are the codes, if you like, the instructions for making new organisms. To make a human cell, we all have something of the order of 40 to 50,000 genes. We need that for the complexity of our body and all its interactions. If we move down the scale of complexity to bacteria, your average bacteria has something like 5,000 or 6,000 genes in order to make new bacterial cells. If we move down and considered viruses, we get a massive comparison difference. Some viruses only carry of the order of 9 genes, and those are genes simply for making new virus particles. Because the virus particles are very simple, they need very few genes. Some viruses are a little bit more complicated than that and have of the order of 100 genes, but basically we're comparing a handful of genes that viruses have, demonstrating their biological simplicity, compared with bacteria, which have hundreds of times more, and animals, which have something of the order of 40 to 60,000 genes. There are, in fact, vast numbers of viruses, and they differ very much from each other. So there are classes. The coronaviruses are a particular class. They're related to each other, but, for example, they bear no relationship whatsoever to things like hepatitis virus or mumps virus or measles virus, all of which fall into different classes. And in fact, many symptoms of particular viral diseases are caused by viruses of different classes. So, for example, hepatitis virus, which causes liver damage, there are 4 or 5 different kinds of hepatitis viruses, all of which differ very significantly from each other. And of course, viruses which are specific for humans or animals bear no relationship to viruses which attack plants or viruses which attack bacteria. Yes, coronaviruses tend to be specific for particular species. So, for example, bats carry coronaviruses, and many other animal species do. And those viruses have evolved to be specific for that particular animal. But what happens in things like pandemics is very occasionally, a virus from one species will cross the barrier into another species. So this present coronavirus causing the pandemic has probably come from some animal, possibly a bat, and has been able to attack human cells. And the problem with that, as far as the danger is concerned, is that we have no resistance to it. So there are plenty of human coronaviruses which cause colds, to which most of us have resistance. So the colds have relatively mild symptoms. This particular virus coming from another species, jumping species, causes very major problems because we don't have any resistance to it. And therefore, it is able to attack cells without us having sufficient defenses to protect ourselves from those virus particles, rather. A virus can only live, if we use that in inverted commas, once it gets into a cell. It can only make new virus particles when it has got inside of this particular type of cell which attacks. Outside of that situation, the virus doesn't do anything. It acts basically just like a chemical. But viruses vary in their stability, so some of them may last on surfaces or on drops of saliva which have been sneezed out or coughed out for a relatively short period of time. It may be a few days in the case of some viruses, it may be just a few hours, but essentially outside of the cell, they have no active life at all. They just remain as virus particles. And unless they find a cell which they can attack again, then they don't do anything. They just remain there until essentially they lose their stability and then become totally inactive. Viruses only spread by physical contact between a person and the virus. The type of physical contact depends on the virus and where the viruses come from. So respiratory viruses like influenza and coronavirus spread either directly by people coughing or sneezing and viruses being extruded in the drops that are present as a result of a cough or a sneeze, or indirectly by coughing or sneezing or touching surfaces, and then somebody picking it up on their fingers and transferring it to their mouth or to their nose. Other viruses, for example, Ebola, which is an incredibly dangerous virus, is spread by physical contact between the blood of infected people and another individual. And again, it's the physical contact of somebody touching that blood and transferring it into their own system, if you like. And things like norovirus, which cause diarrhea and projectile vomiting, again, it's fairly obvious that to get the physical contact has to be poor hygiene and contact with either feces or vomit, or surfaces in which feces or vomit are actually touched. Well, there's some good news in that some viruses have been or nearly have been eradicated. For example, smallpox virus, which killed millions of people over the centuries, has been eradicated. And a World Health Organization scheme to attack all smallpox outbreaks by vaccinating people in the proximity of that thing, of that infection, worked. So from about 1950s into about 1975, World Health Organization eradicated the smallpox virus by simply eliminating the possibility of anybody else catching it. So it's sort of a blanket vaccination process. However, that was only possible because smallpox is unique to human beings. The trouble is with influenza and coronaviruses and many other viruses, similar viruses exist in other species. And we could only eradicate it from the planet by eradicating it from those species. Pandemics of these kind of viruses are always going to occur because every 20, 30, 40 years or so, a virus is going to jump from another species into humans and then will cause this kind of disease because humans don't have any resistance to it, in that there's no immunity in the system for them to happen. So coronaviruses will never be eradicated, but particular viruses tend to lose their virulence and their pathogenicity after a couple of years. And the best example of this is if we go back to 1918 or so, when there was the famous Spanish flu pandemic, which killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people, more than had been killed in the Great War beforehand. And this attacked in two waves, but the third wave, which occurred after 3 years, was minor, and it eventually died out. So that probably means that everybody who had survived had resistance to it, and the virus was therefore no more harmless. Viruses which exist in other species, similar viruses to human viruses which exist in other species, are called reservoir species because those species carry a reservoir of viruses which potentially and very infrequently have the opportunity to jump into human species. And if there is a reservoir, then we can never eradicate it from the planet. We can simply try, as we're doing with this present coronavirus pandemic, to minimize the effect of the virus on the population by limiting the number of people and by developing vaccines and treatments for the virus. Well, we all have an immune system, which is a very complicated mechanism which recognizes and eliminates foreign bodies from our system. When we get a virus attacking, then this triggers the response of the immune system, and over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, this system moves into operation to eradicate the virus. The problem is that if it's a very pathogenic virus, it can have more effect before the defense is built up to attack it. So it's a question of, if we want to put it rather simply, does the virus kill you before you kill the virus? What vaccination does is pre-program the immune system to be ready for a virus which is going to attack it. And essentially what happens is that some innocuous material which looks like the virus is injected into your system in advance of any virus attack. And that, because you're putting in something which looks is very similar to the virus, triggers the system so that you have the immune system ready when the virus attacks. And many of those immune systems last for many years. So we can be inoculated or vaccinated early on, and it can last for years in many cases. The kind of things which are used to vaccinate with, if we go back to the very first use of vaccination, which was in the beginning of the 19th century by Jenner, who discovered that cowpox, which is a disease of the cow, pustules from cowpox carrying the cowpox virus, if injected into a human, protected them against smallpox. And that's simply because the cowpox virus is very similar to the smallpox virus. So having got an immune system which acted against the cowpox virus, it would then act against the smallpox and protect in advance. Subsequent use of similar viruses, or very often viruses which have been killed, so a live active virus, but one which has been killed in the laboratory, can be used as a vaccine. Alternatively, the virus can be grown in such a way that it retains many of its characteristics, but has none of its pathogenicity, can be used. And some of the more modern techniques actually look at various parts of the virus and inject the parts of them. So very often they're the parts on the surface of the virus, which is what the immune system recognizes, the outside of the virus. If you take, let's say, one of the proteins, which is part of the surface of the virus, and inject that, that can trigger the response of the immune system to attack the virus itself if the virus infects. So many of the laboratories now which are looking to make vaccines to the coronavirus are using probably one or other of those particular technologies in order to make a vaccine. But the vaccine has to be in itself harmless, but will protect against later infection by the virus. Absolutely certain we will, and we will probably within 12 months or so. But these things take a while to develop. They have to be proved to be effective, and they also have to be proved to be safe. So a lot of the delay will be the necessary testing before it can be released as a general vaccine. And then, of course, the problem is then making it in sufficiently large quantities in order to be able to distribute it widely within populations. But I'm absolutely certain, there's no doubt that a vaccine to any virus can be made given the amount of investment of time and money into the process. There's been much discussion in the media recently of the term viral load. I think there may be two different meanings to the word viral load. One is quite simply a measure of the number of virus particles in a particular individual. So it might be the number of used to describe the number of viruses in, for example, 1 milliliter of blood. If you don't have the virus, you have zero viral load, and as the virus attacks you, the viral load goes up. But I think there is another context, is, if you like, there may well be a critical dose of viruses that you need to ingest or take contact with before it causes the disease. So it may be that a very small number of virus particles of a particular virulent virus is all you need for exposure. It may be that you need a very large number of viruses. But the thing to remember is that viruses, when they're in contaminated fluids, in coughs or sneezes, can be present in very large amounts. So there can be many thousands of them because they're so small and because they're so efficiently made by the cells which are manufacturing the viruses. I think the first thing to learn is that pandemics will always occur. They always occur because there are viruses in other species, and what I've not said beforehand is that the way viruses are reproduced, very often lots of changes, mutations occur within them, so viruses are constantly changing. During our lifetime, certainly during my lifetime, there have been a number of absolutely novel and unexpected viruses which have turned up. Two of them are Ebola and HIV, which causes AIDS. And these have been complete surprises, and they've turned out to be extremely lethal and dangerous to those people that get infected with them. And that kind of thing, I'm afraid, is going to occur. One of the most likely pandemic viruses is the influenza virus. And the World Health Organization takes a lot of trouble to be prepared in advance. Influenza spreads around the world with winters. So influenza is far more common in the winter than it is in the summer, presumably because people get colds as well, and colds and influenza go well together because it causes sneezing and coughing and spread of the virus, which happens less in the summer. There are now available influenza vaccines, which are always made year on, year out to be like the virus which infected last year. So we're prepared. These viruses are made in advance. One has a year to prepare them, in a sense, and they're available each year. So those of us which are old get these vaccinations every year, which essentially are against last year's virus. That's because the influenza virus is changing slightly from year to year due to these mutational changes. What you can't be prepared for is one of these jumps from another species, which occurs a major change, causes a major change in the virus for which we have no resistance or have very little resistance. So pandemics are always going to be there. We can prepare for things like influenza, and we can probably now prepare for coronavirus, because it's possible that this is going to attack in subsequent years and may become an annual process, just like influenza. What we can't protect against is the unusual and sometimes very dangerous jumps of viruses like Ebola and HIV, which turn up out of the blue, crossing from one species to the other and causing vast amounts of danger and death.